Welcome to Teleforum, a podcast of the Federalist Society's practice groups. I'm Dean Reuter, Vice President, General Counsel, and Director of Practice Groups at the Federalist Society. For exclusive access to live recordings of practice group Teleforum calls, become a Federalist Society member today at fedsoc.org.
Welcome, everyone, to this Federalist Society virtual event as this afternoon, January 11, 2022. We're having a Talks with Authors about a new book about the late, great Justice John Marshall Harlan. Now, the book is called The Great Dissenter, The Story of John Marshall Harlan, America's Judicial Hero. I'm Nick Marr, Assistant Director of Practice Groups here at the Federalist Society. As always, please note that expressions of opinion on our call today are those of our experts. We have a great panel today, including the book's author, to discuss this book, The Legacy of this Great Justice. I'm just going to introduce our moderator, and then he'll take it from there. We're very pleased to be joined this afternoon by Judge Victor Wolski. Judge Wolski is a senior judge at the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. He also has, he's really good at tying bow ties. So with that, Judge Wolski, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nick. It's really a great pleasure for me today to be here at this talk with a good friend of mine, Peter Canellos, who I've known for, he's pointed out, over 40 years. We were classmates together at the University of Pennsylvania, where he was a writer for the school newspaper, and I was involved in student government. And despite our conflicts of interest, we got along pretty well, and we've stayed good friends over the years. So I'm particularly pleased to be here for this event on Peter's new book, The Great Dissenter, The Story of John Marshall Harlan, America's Judicial Hero. Now, as I said, Peter's a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and also Columbia Law School. But despite going to law school, he chose to make his mark in journalism rather than the law, and was formerly the Washington bureau chief and then the editorial page editor for the Boston Globe, where he oversaw 2 Pulitzer Prize-winning projects and somehow along the way ended up being a character in the Oscar award-winning movie Spotlight. Peter is currently the managing editor for Enterprise at Politico magazine. Also joining us for today's talk is a person who needs no introduction for the Federalist Society, but I'll introduce him anyway. Our regular guest here, Josh Blackman. As you know, Josh is a professor at South Texas College of Law, Houston. He graduated from Penn State University and George Mason University School of Law, clerked for Judge Danny Boggs on the Sixth Circuit, and is the author, among other things, of Unraveled and also of Unprecedented, which are 2 books about the Affordable Care Act. I guess we got to come up with another untitled for a third one.
Third one will be undefeated.
Undefeated or unfunded, perhaps. He's also the co-founder and president of a nonprofit that's named after Justice Harlan. And I understand that the reason it was named after Justice Harlan is because he was one of the few justices that everyone from whatever end of the spectrum, politically or legally, a person was admired by universally. Is that correct?
Among other reasons, absolutely.
Very good. And that's called the Harlan Institute, which provides constitutional education and civics education and programming for high school students. So thank you, Josh. Now, as I said, Peter's book was a delight to read. It's great to see somebody who has both a legal education, but also a journalist's eye and a journalist's ability to craft a narrative and to make the history come alive on the pages. And he's really done a great job. I think he's found his calling as a biographer. As the book's been well received, don't just take it from me. Republican Senate Leader Mitch McConnell, who's biased because he's also from Kentucky, as is Justice Harlan, said that The Great Dissenter was, quote, a marvelous read, extremely well written. I highly recommend it. Now, no less a luminary than George Will, in one of his columns, called the book splendid and stirring, and he found it particularly timely as legal and policy debates shift from the concept of equal opportunity towards notions of equity. Virtually every law student remembers that day in probably their second semester of law school when they're in common law class, when you learn Plessy versus Ferguson and you read The Dissent by John Marshall Harlan, and the dissent just usually rings out to a law student, and you think, what was wrong with the rest of these guys? This guy got it, the other ones didn't. Harlan was known in his time not just for that dissent, but for taking a principled position on a lot of major issues, particularly known as the one justice who is consistently vigilant and stood up for the rights of Black men and women in America. His dissent in Plessy, as you know, has the proclamation, "Our Constitution is colorblind." And when you read that in law school, you just can't help but say, where was the rest of these guys? Now, Peter, why 40 years or 30 some years later after law school, why did you turn to Harlan, and why this book? What was it remembering that dissent, or is there something else about Harlan?
No, definitely remembering that dissent, but also remembering other dissents that I read in law school, and just being struck even so many years ago that, here was somebody who 100 years after these decisions came through, clearly saw the law in a very different way than his contemporaries, and was proven right over time. None of us will have the luxury of knowing how we will be viewed 100 years from now, if we were lucky enough to be viewed at all 100 years from now. And Harlan was somebody who stood the test of time. I also think that he's a deceptively important figure in a number of different ways beyond the Plessy dissent. I think that his whole range of dissents in the race cases, but also in economic cases, helped to set the stage for many of the changes that occurred in the 20th century and in 20th century law, and inspired some of the people who fought for them. So his story also sort of tells us that dissent is really important. This is not just registering a official disagreement with something. This is actually charting a path to a better outcome in the future. As to Harlan's significance, I would refer again to the sort of long tunnel of years. It's been between 100 and 150 years since these decisions took place, and we now know what was important and what wasn't important of those years on the Waite Court and the Fuller Court. And the two things that stand out are that was the era when segregation began, which has had a terrible effect on our civic life and continues to have a terrible effect on our civic life, the legacy of segregation. But it also was a time of tremendous economic inequality. And, you have to ask yourself, well, how do we get to a position where, some peoples are building castles on the Hudson and other people were living 5 and 6 to a room despite having jobs and working? And, the answer to that traces back to these Supreme Court decisions. And if you look at the sort of full range of Harlan's dissents, he'll say not only in Plessy, but look at the civil rights cases of 1883, look at the Berea College case, look at Giles v. Harris. Harlan's forceful dissents on race really contrasted with that of the majority and identified correctly all of the problems that society was destined to face. Also, when the Supreme Court found kind of, dubious fig leaf reasons to declare the Sherman Antitrust Act unconstitutional initially in the E.C. Knight case, and to declare the income tax unconstitutional in Pollock, and to turn in Lochner and tie the hands of state legislatures for certain kinds of legislation for health and safety, Harlan called them out. And I think those dissents as well have been vindicated over time. So you can now say, well, okay, we know he was right. And then we say, well, what was the key to his difference? How did he see things so much more clearly when, as Vic was alluding earlier, the court majority was in a completely different place. The country was in a different place. So he's an impressive figure.
Now, how much of his outlook was shaped by his nationalist views based on his being from a border state of Kentucky, being a protege and family friend of Henry Clay, and choosing to fight on the Union side during the Civil War?
He was hugely affected by it. This was a man who was named after John Marshall, the great Chief Justice. He grew up in an extremely patriotic family, a family that really took to heart. His father was pretty much the leading lawyer in Kentucky, but a family that really took to heart the notion of what we today would call American exceptionalism. But, in his time, he was intensely aware of the idea that democracy was rare, that, the America was standing out. The rest of the world was ruled by various forms of monarchy and despotism. And, America was this great experiment. So he was a strong, strong believer in the principles behind the Declaration of Independence, the principles behind the Constitution. He also grew up completely under the shadow of this looming Civil War. And just like Henry Clay and other Kentuckians, leading Kentuckians, his family believed that Kentucky would be destroyed by this war, both because of geography as a border state, but also because it was half northern and half southern sympathies. So its civic fabric would be destroyed. So they had this sense that they were going to be the victims of everything that was transpiring in both North and South. And that's obviously why Henry Clay and other Kentuckians were at the forefront of all of the compromises that were attempted to try to resolve the sectional dispute over slavery. And so Harlan grew up in an atmosphere where he believed that politics was sort of going crazy and law would be the only source of compromise, the only source of solution. And I think that, that's part of the John Marshall legacy. That's why he was named for the Chief Justice who declared the supremacy of law over politics. And then all of this leads up to the Dred Scott decision, where Harlan, I think, came to believe in his bones, even though he articulated some different things. He tried to push the idea that Dred Scott could resolve things initially, but then for all of the rest of his life, cited Dred Scott as a terrible example of the Supreme Court going awry. But it gave him this sense of the stakes in these Supreme Court decisions. So when people say, where did he get the courage to dissent? Where did he get the courage of his convictions? It was because he understood that, there was a finality to the Supreme Court decisions that is unique in American life. And that after Dred Scott, he felt like all those compromises that he had fought for were now impossible. And the nation was on a path to war.
It's interesting you'd mentioned Dred Scott, because I think probably the dissent by Benjamin Curtis in Dred Scott is the first great dissent that people know of. That before, dissents were very short things, just saying I don't agree and giving very little reason. But the evisceration of the majority opinion by Benjamin Curtis, showing how on originalism grounds there were actually freed black citizens who participated in the body politic at the time that the Constitution was ratified. It was a very important decision, a very important opinion, and may well, I think, have served as an exemplar for Harlan when he had the courage to write his dissents, often by himself.
I think that's true. I think the big difference with Curtis was that Curtis resigned in protest while, Harlan stayed for 28 years after his first big dissent in the civil rights cases of 1883, and was sort of this constant dissent present. But I agree with you that Curtis's dissent would have been strongly on his mind. And obviously his family also were very, very skeptical of Justice Taney and saw him as sort of the Democrat, usurper of Marshall's throne there. So yes, you would have identified strongly with Curtis.
Yeah. Other than that dissent, I guess the Chief Justice Marshall's dissent in Ogden versus Sanders is the only other one that I can think of from earlier that stands out at all. But anyway, well, in addition to being from Kentucky and a border state, he was also obviously from a slaveholding state, and in fact from a slaveholding family. And one of the prominent figures in your book is in part a biography not just of John Marshall Harlan, but also of Robert Harlan, who was grew up essentially as an elder brother, was treated as an elder brother in the family. Could you explain Robert Harlan and his significance on John Marshall Harlan's career and possibly his thought?
Yeah, Robert Harlan was a very powerful and intriguing character in his own right. He was born in Virginia, enslaved in Virginia, traveled with his mother over 450 miles by all these later accounts, because he became involved in politics. We know from a lot of profiles that were written in the newspaper that he came 450 miles to find his father, went to Harlan Station, which was essentially a family town in Kentucky. So I think we can assume that they believed his father was a member of the Harlan family, and he ended up, through mysterious circumstances we don't completely know, being owned by James Harlan, who was the father of John Harlan before John's birth. And while his mother remained enslaved and was sent down south, but apparently still exchanged some letters with James Harlan and remained on solid terms with James Harlan. And apparently right from the start, Robert, who was of mixed race, was treated very differently from the other enslaved people in the family. James Harlan tried to educate him, but that was impossible for a person who was Black and enslaved at the time.
We tried to get him enrolled in school, right? The school wouldn't allow
him enrolled in school. Yeah, he was educated at home, but James Harlan wanted him to go to school, and he wasn't able to go to school. Mm-hmm. And paradoxically, the fact that he wasn't able to go to school liberated him from one aspect of the Harlan family, because there were 5 brothers that John had of his own, all white brothers, who obviously were not enslaved and who were committed to this sort of rigorous study of the law by their father from the time they were very, very young. Robert was able to sort of develop a skill that was to hold him in very good stead later in life by necessity, and that is finding ways to succeed in opportunities even against the most horrific odds, being born enslaved, being denied any form of education, being denied anything. So he started off as a horse racing pioneer, because many of the original horse racing owners in Kentucky were slave owners, and their enslaved men were the jockeys and trainers. So it was a very multiracial scene there. And Robert developed this reputation for being able to size up a horse on site, and he would help organize sort of barnstorming style races. Then he spotted the gold rush as another opportunity, understanding that the old kind of racial prejudices that held people back would not be in place in San Francisco, where you had people coming from all around the world to try to find gold. He returned from the gold rush a very wealthy man and moved to Cincinnati, which at the time was the terminus of the Underground Railroad. This is before the Fugitive Slave Act. And in the early 1850s, began investing in Black-owned businesses, seeing real potential in people coming out of slavery. And these ranged from a grocer, something as simple as a grocer, to something as complicated as a group of Black photography pioneers, recognizing again that new technology was something that would be less encumbered by racial barriers. And also he owned the mortgage, or held part of the mortgage, on something called the Dumas House, which was the leading hostelry for free Black men during that time, and where a lot of runaway slaves were held, were sort of hidden and stayed after the Fugitive Slave Act. So Robert Harlan then spent the Civil War years in England, becoming a rather well-known person because he owned horses in Kentucky by then and brought them to England to stage these transatlantic races, and became well-known in British racing circles. Then returned after the war to assume a position as the leading Black politician in Ohio, and certainly the leading supporter of the Republican Party in Ohio. And because Ohio was the swing state in presidential politics, and because the Black vote was very crucial to the Republican Party, he was, a confederate in some ways of all of the great, Ohio politicians, many of them on the national stage. Hayes, certainly, James Garfield, certainly McKinley, Benjamin Harrison. He was a well-known person to them. And so after the war, when John Harlan is considered for the Supreme Court under this very odd set of circumstances, where Hayes has been given the presidency, but sort of committed behind the scenes to appointing a Southerner, but he needed a Southerner who was good on civil rights, who could pass a Senate Judiciary Committee that was run by George Edmunds of Vermont, who was a dedicated civil rights supporter. There was a lot of politics going on in the background, and Robert Harlan was playing a role in advocating for John. We don't know how much of a role that was. We don't know. We do know that he would be sending letters back reporting to John on his chances of getting the nomination. But I think we can imagine that in that atmosphere, Robert's support meant a lot, for people who are actually doubting Harlan's commitment to civil rights, given that he came from a slave-owning family. But to have someone who was enslaved in the same house, who was then the leading Black politician in Ohio, vouching for him, I think was very, very important. So they worked together. They maintained a sense of family loyalty and family feeling. So it's quite an extraordinary part of the Harlan story.
And the experience of Justice Harlan, growing up with Robert Harlan and knowing him for probably most of his entire adult life and probably half of the life before that, may well have contributed, would it not, to Harlan's view on the different races and his belief that in racial equality, which I think is a good reason for us now to turn to Plessy and the civil rights cases in particular and talk, because those are the first big great dissents from Justice Harlan, the things that he's most known for today. If you could talk a little bit about those cases and about how Harlan came to his position.
Well, Harlan came to his position, I think, because of all of those factors we've discussed and many others. I think that having pushed for those compromises in the years leading up to the Civil War, but finding that they failed, having watched the Ku Klux Klan take over Kentucky in a lot of ways after the war, having also recognized, because he was on this Louisiana commission that had looked into a bitter dispute over the gubernatorial election in Louisiana that almost erupted into another war, he came away with a belief that you couldn't keep troops in the South forever, but that the law had to step in when the force of the country could not apply. That the law had to do what the troops were doing for many years after the Civil War, and
civil rights cases of 1883. Those dealt with the congressional reaction to the plight of freed men and women, in which Congress had passed a law forbidding segregation in public accommodations, in the theater, in public railroads, and things like that. It purported to act directly against what private businesses might be doing, right?
Absolutely. And this was the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And the setting for it, which was sort of important, is, here you have Harlan is the only Southerner. He's from Kentucky. He's also the only person, as you were mentioning, who had real personal relationships with African Americans. You had these Northern justices, many of them came from corporate backgrounds, but who had very little exposure to African Americans. And the country, and I think the justices in the Supreme Court, were getting a little bit tired of what was an ongoing sectional sort of dispute and looking for ways to try to resolve it. So the Civil Rights Act that was passed in the Grant administration in 1875 became this huge political issue within the country. And cases piled up both in the North and South, where individual innkeepers, individual restaurateurs, and train porters and conductors, theater operators refused to serve African Americans, and the law was deployed against them. And all these cases were then combined into one requiem. Unlike Plessy, which was not a very well-known case in its time, the Civil Rights case of 1883 was a real national requiem. I would say almost all Americans were aware that this was going on, and it was seen as a big
front page news everywhere. And Harlan, up until that point, had been a fairly, undistinguished cooperative sort of junior member of the Supreme Court. I think that there was a lot of pressure from the court majority to try to have a majority ruling in this big case that was famous across the country and attracting so much attention. But Harlan decided to break very powerfully from his colleagues. This was not just, registering an official kind of disagreement. He felt that he needed to articulate an entirely different way of interpreting the post-war amendments. The majority opinion by Justice Bradley leaned heavily on the state action argument, saying that the post-war amendments were only intended to restrict state action, and that the types of cases across the board that were brought in were discrimination by individuals. Therefore, they were a state matter to be dealt with. This is simplifying it to some degree, but the state action was the key here, and none of these cases had the requisite state action. Harlan, who understood this was only 15 years after the ratification of these amendments,
he was in personal contact with the framers of these amendments. He knew what was intended by these amendments. And he knew that the court was deploying an extremely narrow interpretation that, in his view, defeated the purpose of these amendments.
So in his view, before, under slavery, slavery and the status of people as slaves was the bar that prevented them from being able to go to the theater and being able to go to the restaurants, being able to ride on buses and trains or stagecoaches or what have you. And that once slavery was officially eradicated, that these aspects, this exclusion that continued was a sort of a badge of servitude of slavery that he believed was addressed directly by the 13th Amendment, right?
Yes, and he came up with arguments related to the 13th, 14th Amendments, and even the Commerce Clause, which ultimately would become the source of a civil rights bill in the 1960s. But yes, he said that the 13th Amendment was intended, obviously, to ban badges of servitude, and that denying Black people access to what he was depicting as kind of rudiments of normal life and commerce was indeed a badge of servitude. He also said in the 14th Amendment that people were guaranteed a certain liberty interest that was being defeated by these attempts to discriminate based on race. And he said that in the Commerce Clause, at that time, the government was backing bonds for expanding railroad networks around the country and things like that. And with the dynamic changes in the economy, it was worth exploring whether Congress would have the power under the Commerce Clause to impose such civil rights restrictions. So his opinion in the civil rights cases was not as pithy, not as soaring as his dissent in Plessy. It had some soaring element, but I think he felt the tremendous burden that, here he has to articulate a different set of interpretations of these post-war amendments and the Commerce Clause, for that matter. And it's something that, people have a lot of different opinions on. I've heard some people say, Harlan's dissent in the civil rights cases was all over the place. But I also have heard people say, lawyers talk about it as absolutely brilliant in terms of anticipating where the law was going to go in the 13th, 14th Amendments, as well as the Commerce Clause.
There's a question of symbolism. Was that the one in which he used the inkwell that had belonged to?
Yes, he did. And here he was. This was a very difficult time in his life. His eldest daughter had died shortly after giving birth to a baby, and she was very much the light of their whole family. And he wrote a letter to his sons saying every day of his life would be spent vindicating her tremendous spirit and her tremendous spiritual legacy. And one of the things she had done was teach the children of freedmen and women in a volunteer program in Washington, D.C. So that may have also been on his mind. And they're in a house that they would soon leave because they felt the ghosts of this daughter they had lost was so present in their lives. So he's holed up in a study, and he's trying to do this piece of work that is going to define his career and separate him from his colleagues once and for all. And he was struggling with it. And his wife brings in the inkwell that Harlan himself had saved from some court, reorganization or something like that, that had been Justice Taney's inkwell that he had used to write the Dred Scott opinion. And she said that she very quietly just put it on his desk, and as soon as he started using that ink, the pen started flowing across the page.
And now Plessy, you just said in Plessy he used much more soaring language than the notion of the Constitution being colorblind, not admitting of races. But that one clearly involved state action. That was state of Louisiana telling the railroads that they had to have separate cars for white people and Black people, right? Absolutely,
and. I think that it's very, very rare in any legal opinion to see somebody reach so deep into the sort of foundational principles of American law as Harlan did there. Clearly he felt not only that the majority opinion was wrong on the law and violating the post-war amendments, but it was violating the whole core principle of equality under which the United States was founded. And the lines from that case, you quoted one of them, the Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. the humblest is the peer of the most powerful. There is no caste here. These are strong, forceful statements that sort of resound through the ages and represent the extent to which Harlan felt that these restrictions on African American rights were so deeply offensive to the entire American system. He also articulated in that opinion, as he often did, his predictions sort of for the future. And he predicted, he said, what can more surely sow the seeds of race hate than an enactment based like this one upon the idea that one group of citizens is so degraded that they cannot travel in the railroad car of another. He predicted that far from resolving anything, Plessy v. Ferguson was going to be the source of racial discord for the rest of the time and consigning both white and black Americans to years of pain. So it's an extraordinary document, his dissent, Plessy, and it is the thing that has most resonated at the time. When he died in 1911, there was a memorial service at Metropolitan AME, which is the largest black church still right here in Washington. And there were 1,000 people, all African Americans there, and his dissents were read aloud. And if you put yourself in the mindset of like a young person listening to those words, it does several things. It gives you some hope. It makes you believe that there are white people out there who can see things through the eyes of African Americans, but also that perhaps these cases could be changed. And, Thurgood Marshall was not there. He was born a couple of years later, but he also adopted Harlan as a role model and followed the Plessy dissent. Constance Baker Motley says it was his Bible. And they included it in all of their, the NAACP Defense Fund included it in all of their briefs in the cases leading up to Brown, including Brown. So Harlan played a significant role in sort of germinating the legal strategy behind the 20th century civil rights movement.
Now, before we call Josh in here, one other matter I wanted you to touch on. A case that I found quite astounding and horrifying in some ways, but gratifying in others, I suppose, that you wrote about. A very obscure case involving Sheriff Shipp in Chattanooga, where there was an incident where a poor fellow had been accused, a poor black man had been accused of a rape that he didn't commit and was railroaded through a very improper procedure. And his lawyers come to D.C. because the circuit judge come to Harlan's house because Harlan's the circuit judge overseeing Kentucky, and delivers a application for writ of habeas corpus to try to get the Supreme Court to take the case. And what ensued from that was sort of like almost like mind-boggling. Can you explain that case?
Yeah, what happens is first of all, the context for this is up to that point, the Supreme Court had been very, very reluctant to clamp down on improper state procedures that were harming a lot of defendants throughout the South, throughout other states. It just was very hands-off in its approach there. So here Harlan orders a review of the documentation, hearing a couple of days later in this case. And it was seen by official Chattanooga as such an affront, such a desperate affront, that immediately Harlan and the Supreme Court become the issue more than the rape case at hand. And the sheriff, who has been sort of officially deputized to now hold a federal prisoner, he manages to leave the jail completely unguarded, except for a 73-year-old night watchman. This in a case where mobs have already been gathering repeatedly in front of this jail, and allows essentially a mob to take the prisoner and lynch him on the most prominent public structure in Cincinnati before hundreds of people. And Harlan then rallies the Supreme Court to be willing to hold the local officials accountable and some of the perpetrators for the crime. So Sheriff Shipp and a group of other defendants have to come to Washington to have faced contempt of court charges. And
the court was being tried in the Supreme Court.
And this was the first and only time, and this was the problem, obviously, with the Supreme Court, is that they had no enforcement mechanism. There wasn't a giant FBI. There wasn't a giant federal court system at the time. So they had to sit as a jury. And there was an initial decision in which Holmes wrote the opinion that the jury requirement was satisfied by the 9 justices of the Supreme Court, which I think some people would want to take a close look at that one. But afterwards, it was a fairly easy call to convict Sheriff Shipp and another group of men who were co-conspirators for this horrific lynching. What this did is it's a deceptively important case. It's kind of been forgotten in all the case books because it doesn't have a lot of legal precedent, because it was this weird situation where the court was sitting as a trial court, the Supreme Court was sitting as a trial court. But it gained a lot of sort of significance in Chattanooga and in Tennessee and around the country in recent years, because for one thing, it established a record of all that went into a lynching. And while we know there were thousands of lynchings in the United States, this is the best documented one. And it actually Ed Johnson. Yes. Ed Johnson was the victim. And they recently dedicated in September, I was there, a memorial right at the bridge where he was lynched, a memorial to Ed Johnson with obviously a significant amount of tribute to Harlan as well. And a lot of senior African-American jurists were there saying, this was the first time that Black people really saw the Supreme Court acting on their behalf. And, obviously saw Harlan as the key figure in this. And it attests again to his willingness to call out injustice in very difficult situations.
Now, we talked about the wide admiration that people have for Justice Harlan and the dissents. Some of the dissents he's had. Not all of the dissents have been unanimously agreed with. However, I'd like to turn to Josh Blackman now. Josh, if you would want to talk a little bit about one of the more controversial dissents in the Lochner case.
Sure. And again, thank you, Judge Wolski and Peter, for this enlightening conversation. Harlan's most famous scene is Plessy. People know they don't know the law. But among lawyers, his probably most significant dissent came in a case from 1905 called Lochner versus New York. We all know the facts of the case. New York put restrictions on bake shops. One of the restrictions was limiting how many hours the bakers can work. The Supreme Court upheld most of the restrictions, for example, those involving sanitation. You had to have clean floors. You couldn't have animals. Those were all fine. But the hour law was restricted. The court split 5-4. Justice Peckham wrote your opinion, and he found that the restriction on hours was a violation of the liberty of contract. There were 4 dissenters. One dissent was written by Justice Harlan, another dissent by Justice Holmes. Now, people always know the Holmes dissent because he had these references to Herbert Spencer's social statics and these charges of laissez-faire governance. But Holmes was by himself. No one joined him, right? Holmes basically said, there is no liberty of contract. The 14th Amendment says nothing at all about this. We should simply defer if it can be said this policy is reasonable. The dissent that garnered more votes was Harlan. He was joined by 2 others. Harlan seemed to accept that the 14th Amendment had what we would now call a substantive component. The phrase substantive due process didn't exist in the 1800s. That was a modern phrase. But Harlan seemed to exist that, yes, there's some laws that might violate the liberty of contract. But this ain't it. Harlan sort of applied what we might call a presumption of constitutionality that can be rebutted. He says, well, when we're dealing with these unenumerated rights, we should presume that the legislature is acting rationally. We'll presume it. If there's evidence, bring it forward to show us this law is irrational, but we presume it. The Harlan dissent provided the basis for the New Deal jurisprudence. We talk about overruling Lochner. That never actually happened. But if you read West Coast Hotel v. Parrish and other related cases, the court was sounding in Harlan. Now, you need to read Lochner with another case decided in 1905, indeed a few months later, which was Jacobson. This is a case that's been widely misunderstood and misread by judges of all stripes. I could do an entire hour, and I won't. But Harlan wrote both the Lochner dissent and the Jacobson majority. And the Jacobson majority upheld a Massachusetts law that imposed a $5 penalty on those who did not get a smallpox vaccine. And the sort of deference we see in the Lochner case, in the Lochner dissent, I think it's the same sort of deference we see in the Jacobson case. But cases recognize there is some sort of liberty, there's some right, and the policy must be rational. It can be reviewed by courts for rationality. So these two opinions, a Lochner dissent and the Jacobson majority, decided within months of each other in 1905 were very significant windows into Justice Harlan's jurisprudence.
Thank you. Peter, anything you want to add about Lochner? I know that you viewed Lochner through the prism of the conflict between the rapidly industrializing America and the people who were concerned about health and safety and sanitary conditions and things of that nature. And I guess in Lochner, not wanting to question the motives of the legislatures, the Justice Harlan was deferential and believed that it was a legitimate health and safety issue involved, but also recognized the liberty of contract, right?
Well, yes, in both cases, and he articulated a position as Josh Blackman suggested, that it's actually very similar to the way that the current court views the rational basis test. I think that the other thing that's significant about his views in Lochner is that they showed another side to Harlan. We think of Harlan in terms of Plessy, where he's asserting a right and overturning a legislative action. He actually was quite deferential to legislatures, and this is another facet of his upbringing. He believed that in a democracy, in a democratic government, the Congress and the legislatures needed to have the tools to sort of wrestle with big national problems. And that, I think, is also a legacy of that period growing up under the threat of the Civil War coming. So he actually spent a lot of his career defending the notion of judicial restraint and imploring colleagues not to have their own political judgment replace that of the political branches, and that's very visible in his Lochner dissent.
Now, in the judicial philosophy department, there, judicial restraint. Josh, would you say that Justice Harlan might have been a progenitor of the thought of, say, Felix Frankfurter and that type of approach to judging? Or?
Well, I think the leading of restraint was actually Thayer, who was one of the leading scholars at the time. And Thayer and Holmes line up pretty carefully that unless some law is palpably unconstitutional, the court should leave it alone. I don't think Harlan went quite that far. I think he had a broader willingness to assess if laws were unconstitutional. Look no further than Plessy or the civil rights cases. He took acts of Congress to be unconstitutional. He took Louisiana segregation laws invalid. So I think Holmes would have upheld both. I think Holmes would have said, "Yep, Plessy, go for it," and "Yep, civil rights." That's not, I think Holmes would have been okay in both of those. So Harlan really has this intermediate, what we call presumption of constitutionality. I do want to mention one other thing that in my own experiences that people may not know about Harlan. He was a professor. During his tenure, he taught at the George Washington Law School, Columbia Law School, in evenings and weekends to basically students with full-time careers. And he would teach common law. Can you imagine having a sitting Supreme Court justice teaching you about the Constitution and often talk about his cases before they decide, and decide you say things like, "Well, I was in dissent, so I was wrong."
So obviously he was wrong, right? Because the Supreme Court spoke and he was outvoted.
Of course. And one of his students in 1897 transcribed his notes verbatim. And I actually went to the Library of Congress with a colleague and we actually digitized them. So if you want to put the link in the chat, read all of Harlan's lecture notes. They were truly remarkable. He would teach the Constitution, not by cases, but by clause, starting with the preamble and working through each clause. I actually took some pedagogical tips from John Harlan. So I feel forever in debt for him.
So he might be one of the original textualists.
I think he was a proto-originalist.
You should also read the law review article that Josh and Brian Fry wrote on those lectures that Harlan gave. It's very, very illuminating in terms of his judicial philosophy, but also his personality. Just like as Josh was suggesting, with him always joking, he said, "Well, this was my view, but I guess I was wrong." It's like
some of his other dissents, I think, and unfortunately, some of his joining of majority opinions ended up being somewhat controversial, particularly the Chinese exclusion cases. I think have been viewed as problematic by people of our generation, I suppose. Maybe not obviously not so at the time.
People frequently ask about that when talking about Harlan. I think it's worth noting that the Che Chan-ping case, which was the main Chinese exclusion case, is still good law today. I mean, the only legal issue in that case was whether Congress can abrogate a treaty once it's been ratified, and that is still good law today. So
he rested his decisions on treaty power and on the ability of Congress to limit immigration, right?
It was the ability of Congress to limit immigration, but the entire Chinese worker system was the product of a treaty that had the Chinese workers in this country remaining subjects of the Chinese emperor. I think that, people look at this case and they'll look at some language in other Harlan opinions and things and sort of say, well, did he have a special bias against the Chinese? I think that, first of all, if you look at the totality of his opinions, he was the person who stood up for the rights of Filipinos and native Filipinos and Hawaiians in the insular cases very strongly. And
those are the cases which involve the territories that we acquired during the Spanish-American War, and whether or not constitutional rights not necessarily flowed to the people who lived there once they became part of the United States.
Yeah, and he was the leader of the legal, Constitution must follow the flag. And in fact, it's very powerful because you can tell that he sees the same seeds of discord in those cases that led to the Civil War, and he kept saying, we cannot have a system in which half of the people living under the American flag, or a large portion of them living under the American flag, have full constitutional rights where the Constitution is the supreme authority. And then you have this large number of millions of people living under the power of the United States, in which Congress is the supreme authority. He saw it as another revival of the old cancer of inequality. But he also, many of the majority opinions had very racially problematic views about the capacities of Hawaiians and Filipinos to live in a free society and things like that. And Harlan rejected those notions and said the Constitution should follow the flag and they should have full constitutional rights. He also defended the right of a Native American to obtain birthright citizenship if they made a decision to leave their tribal government and assert birthright citizenship. So it's improbable to say that he had this strong equal rights ideology for all these other groups, but not the Chinese. But the difference in the Chinese case was that they were not American citizens. They were, and he noted that in various points, they were subjects of the Chinese emperor. And so the legal
that even included the fellow who was born in America to Chinese parents and lived here for 20 some years before he emigrated back for a time to China, right? That was Harlan joined a dissent in that case by Fuller. This was a case in which the court granted birthright citizenship to a Chinese person. He joined with Fuller, citing a doctrine dating back to common law days that you had to make an affirmative choice to become a U.S. citizen. Mm-hmm. If the parents had wanted their son to be a U.S. citizen, if that was part of the plan, that was Harlan's view on birthright citizenship, as well as Fuller's view. Not that it would just occur sort of automatically. And in fact, in one of the lectures that's in Josh's article, Harlan posits the idea of a British couple coming to Hot Springs and then having a child here because of, at that time, obviously you couldn't go back to England at that point, but with no intention of renouncing their loyalty to the crown. Does that child become an American just because their parents were on a trip to the United States when it was born? He would say no under those statutes, and that's a little more of an outlying opinion. And he did join Fuller in
in that.
But you want to go Q&A? We have about 10 minutes left. Maybe we should take some questions.
Okay, yes, we got. Can you see the questions, Josh and Peter?
I can.
Okay, why don't we handle the first question we have about Harlan's deferential approach he took to due process in Lochner, whether that's at odds with his approach to the Equal Protection Clause. Josh, do you have a?
Sure, and I think that's from Chris, who seems to be here in Houston with me at St. Thomas. I think Harlan's view of the due process clause was largely based on the fact that it was unenumerated, right? What does it mean of liberty? One of his final exams, I have his final exam. What does liberty mean in the 14th Amendment? I don't know. Ask Justice Kennedy, right? And I think Harlan was very hesitant when he's dealing with this sort of unenumerated concept of liberty to sort of be engaged and to sort of reach beyond the text of the Constitution. But equal protection is clear as day, right? I mean, he seemed to think that he knew what equal protection meant. He lived through the Civil War. He understood what Reconstruction was. He knew what it meant. So he wasn't as hesitant. The second part says, ignorance of Harlan's arguments contribute to colorblind Constitution points in his favor. So, the most famous line of the Harlan dissent is, we want a Constitution that's colorblind. And today that's not quite woke enough, right? Many people who are progressive want a color conscious approach to a college admissions, for example. Color conscious approach to college admissions, right? You have Justice Thomas dissenting, saying we need to be race blind, and Justice Thomas compares those who favor action to the segregationists in town. So I got to tell you, Harlan has been a little bit of rough sledding recently because people don't like race neutrality. It doesn't actually work. They want race consciousness. So I think if we go back to Harlan, the OG, we may get some guidance and some clarity.
Peter, what do you?
I'll add one thing that Thurgood Marshall, while he was in his last years on the court, was asked about this, how he, as a Harlan admirer, could support affirmative action. And he said, because the country didn't follow Harlan in Plessy in 1896, means that now in 1987, we have to undo the ills of the intervening period. So he sort of squared it by talking about the remedial nature of affirmative action and saying that, in his view, Harlan would not be offended by affirmative action.
Now, Justice Harlan served on the Supreme Court with some towering figures in court history, including in his early part of his career with Stephen J. Field, whose memorial actually towers over John Marshall Harlan's simple flat gravestone in the Rock Creek Cemetery, where they both happen to be buried a few miles from here. Another one was the fellow who wrote short, cranky, but pithy things that got a lot of attention, Oliver Wendell Holmes. Now, between Holmes and Harlan, Peter, who do you think was the greater justice?
I think that Harlan was the greater justice. I think that you can refer to a Louise Weinberg article on this question of looking at Holmes. It's not specifically positing Holmes versus Harlan. It's more in a critical analysis of Holmes, but it does offer the opinion that Harlan was a greater justice, and that Holmes has kind of impressed the legal world with his doctrinal brilliance and the glittering aphorisms, that he would cite. Whereas Harlan had this sort of firmer sense of justice. You were mentioning earlier some of the Chinese cases, and he joined that Fuller opinion as well, that was seen as problematic or racially problematic. But if those are among the very, very few perceived blemishes on his record, compare it to the cases where today we would say Holmes was completely wrong. Holmes was writing cases that had people who were protesting the war peacefully outside of an induction center being put in jail. He was in the eugenics case. He was supporting mass sterilization. There's a lot of very bad Holmes opinions, and some of the opinions in which Harlan's dissents now loom large, like the Berea College case, which banned interracial education, even in private colleges in separate ways. Holmes was on the wrong side, So I do believe that Harlan surpasses Holmes.
Now, while your book focuses primarily on the dissents, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention a few of the majority opinions that Justice Harlan wrote that were particularly significant in the areas of property rights. For instance, he wrote the opinion in Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad Company versus Chicago, which was the first case to incorporate one of the provisions of the Bill of Rights, the Takings Clause, into the 14th Amendment. He also wrote Smith versus Ames, which adopted the standard of a fair return on the present value of assets of a railroad as constitutionally required under the Takings Clause. He wrote Adair versus United States, which struck down a federal statute that had banned the so-called yellow dog contracts, the non-union contracts, and he struck that down, violating liberty of contract. So with that also, that record on the side of economic rights, one wonders, where would he have fallen, perhaps, if he was still on the court at the time of Wickard versus Filburn? Would he have agreed with, would his deference to the legislature allowed it to happen, or would he instead have leaned the other way? Peter, Josh?
I'll take it. That's actually an excellent question. In one of Harlan's lectures for students, he told them, when you guys become lawyers, pay very close attention to the commerce. He said that will be the most important part of the Constitution for the next century. He said this very clearly. And if you read his dissent in the lottery, or his opinion in the lottery cases, it more or less presages how the New Deal Court read federal power of the Commerce, Necessary, and Proper Clause. He has an entire lecture on what happens when we have, the steam rails that didn't exist at the time of the framing. He understood very clearly where things were going. And I think that the New Deal justices didn't always give him credit. By the way, Holmes is so overrated. Oh my goodness. He doesn't deserve nearly the credit he gets. He was a hero, patriot, shot in the battlefield, but his opinions were poorly reasoned consistently. He had a good turn of phrase, but I will take Harlan over Holmes any day.
Well, Vic, you also alluded.
Get down, you fool, at Abraham Lincoln when snipers were shooting during the Civil War.
Well, Holmes, interestingly, Holmes never had a good word to say about anybody. When people talk about the first class temperament comment about Franklin Roosevelt, they forget the rest of it, but second class intellect, it's that was Holmes, and Holmes attacked Lincoln, and Holmes also had some funny comments about Harlan, calling him the last of the tobacco spitting judges. But you alluded to another aspect of Harlan's career that we don't have much time to talk about now, and that is his support for the incorporation doc. He was considered way an outlier in his time, suggesting that the Bill of Rights was incorporated as applied to states in the post-war amendments. And, we moved closer to that position significantly in our time. And so what was considered the crazy outlying position is pretty mainstream today in terms of Harlan.
Well, what do you think is the greatest legacy of Harlan's constitutional thought today? Where is it going to manifest itself most in the years to come?
Well, I think that his greatest contribution is his reference to the foundational principles of American law and his insistence that people follow the notion of equality and equal protection. I mean, that he is the father of equal protection. He's the believer in the Equal Protection Clause, and many people see that at a very problematic time in Supreme Court history, he was the person who was supporting the Constitution and had a much firmer sense of what a constitutional system would yield and should yield in that era than his colleagues did.
And do you have any sense of how many sole dissents he wrote compared to other justices?
It's hard to know because he wrote so many. I guess I don't know if there's been an accounting of how many of them were not held. Interestingly, some people ask questions and say, well, why didn't he stick with the majority and try to work within the system to get a better result? And the reality is that in many of these solo dissents, his position was so much at odds with his colleagues. It was considered just a fundamentally different position. And then the irony, of course, is that today we view Harlan's position as the mainstream and the court majorities as the outlier.
Thank you.
I think we're at time.
We're at time, but I want to I didn't have a chance to say what an honor it is to be here with all of you and to also be with Judge Wolski, who's such a model of public servant and such an impressive person and a great friend. And also Josh Blackman, who has done a lot to preserve Harlan's memory and to extend his legacy into the current day, and who's
kind. Thank you.
And I want to thank Peter and
also
Josh.
played a role in the book too.
Thank you.
Thank both of you guys for making this a very good program. It's a really great book. I urge everyone check it out. The Great Dissenter. You won't regret it.
Thank you.
Take care.
Yeah, thank you. The link to the book can be found on the webpage for this event, fedsoc.org. You can go find the book link and purchase it there. I just want to extend thanks on behalf of the Federalist Society to you, Peter, Judge Wolski, Josh, everyone for participating, the benefit of your valuable time and expertise on this really interesting topic this afternoon. So thank you very much. Thank you also to our audience for tuning in, for your great questions. Sorry to any we didn't get to, but I think we covered them. Be sure to check your email and our website for announcements about upcoming events like this one. And until next time, we are adjourned.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Teleform, a podcast of the Federalist Society's practice groups. For more information about the Federalist Society, the practice groups, and to become a Federalist Society member, please visit our website at fedsoc.org.